This videocast will take you through the planning stages of an A-level history essay question, which is as follows. To what extent did Bismarck achieve his political goals in the years 1870 to 79? So what would my plan look like? Always useful to think of the planning stage consisting of two separate sections. The first part is question analysis, and then the second part is the actual plan itself. So let's focus on the question analysis first. It's important to do this. Too often A-level students will leap too quickly into drafting a plan and then actually writing the answer without actually thinking through and looking through the keywords in the question. So careful time thinking about the keywords of the question is crucial. So as you can see, I've got 3 points here to look at. So we'll focus in first of all on that first point. The phrase political goals is crucial. Distinguish between a goal and a policy. They're not the same. A policy is a means of achieving a goal. Okay, so the latter is a means of achieving the former. Weaker candidates will structure their answers around policies, whereas in fact, looking at the question is about political goals, so the answer needs to be structured around goals. An example of that would be weaker candidates will say, okay, a goal was the Kulturkampf, okay, Bismarck's war on the Catholics. Well, actually, no, the Kulturkampf was the policy that was used as part of the political goal, and the political goal was about challenging international forces that were undermining national unity. So that's what the goal is. The Kulturkampf is the policy that was used to achieve the goal. So you need to distinguish between them, and your answer therefore needs to be structured around goals, not around policies. Okay. Secondly, there's an implicit emphasis because it says political goals. It doesn't say economic goals, it doesn't say social goals, it doesn't say foreign policy goals. And implicitly, therefore, the question is about domestic politics, about domestic policies. It's not really about foreign policy. And again, weaker candidates, because it's there in the textbook and because we do a lesson on it, the war in sight crisis is what I'm referring you to. Well, the war in sight crisis is a foreign policy strand. And just because we do a lesson in it doesn't mean that you've got to write a paragraph about this in the exam. And so weaker candidates, without thinking, will just bolt into their essay a paragraph about the war in sight crisis. Now, I'm not saying that the war and sight crisis is not relevant, but if you're going to use it, you need to make it relevant to the question. And that means you need to link it to the domestic agenda. So, for example, therefore, I would bring the war and sight crisis into the building block where you're talking about nationalism versus internationalism, Bismarck's war on the Catholics, the Kulturkampf, the war on the socialists. Well, within that particular theme, you could reference the war and sight crisis by linking it to the domestic agenda. Then the third point, the dates are also crucial. Cover the full period, 1871 to 1879. That's the date range for depth study 1 for the specification. Ensure your answer has got the breadth. Again, if at the end of it your answer is so heavily weighted, let's say on the earlier period 1871 to 75, and you virtually don't make any reference to what was happening between 1875 and 1879, well then your answer lacks balance. You're given those dates for a purpose. You need to make sure your answer covers the full range of dates. Also, Bismarck's goals changed over time. So I would actually, with this particular question, plan your answer in chronological order, what we call a chronological analysis. In other words, start with his early goals, okay, the early 1870s, the Constitution, the alliance with the National Liberals to create unity, all of those sorts of policies were from the early 1870s. Then move into the mid-1870s, which in particular is the Kulturkampf. And then in the final third of your answer, move to the late 1870s when he broke with the National Liberals and he moved more to the political right as part of the introduction of protectionism and as a result of that Sammlungspolitik and the alliance of steel and rye. Okay, now you may be thinking, oh, hold it, we've been told we're not to write narratives. Okay, and a narrative is not the same as a chronological analysis. Yes, a narrative is bad. If you simply start in 1871 and work your way through to 1879 and you simply describe what was happening, you tell a story of what happened, that's a narrative. But it is possible to structure a good A-level essay around chronological time blocks. In other words, you approach, you plan, you structure your answer into chronological time periods, starting with the earlier time period, moving to the later. But within that answer, you maintain a strong analysis. So that's not the same as a narrative. It is possible to still have a chronological structure without it becoming a narrative, is the point that we're making there. Let's move on. So, my plan, in a nutshell, it would consist of 7 paragraphs. That would include the introduction and conclusion, paragraphs 1 and 7. So there'd be 5 main parts to my answer. Okay, and within each of those 5 main body parts, the paragraphs, I would sustain a strong focus on the question. Okay, referencing for each of those sections whether this was a success or failure in my topic sentence. Explain the aim and then analyse the outcomes of Bismarck's actions. So let's say the first part of your answer is going to be about strengthening national unity by alliance with the National Liberals. So you very clearly in your topic sentence explain what Bismarck's aim was, what his goal was, state clearly early on whether that policy succeeded or failed, or whether it was elements of each, then explain the aim and analyse the outcomes of Bismarck's actions. Time permitting, I would incorporate foreign policy, the war on site crisis, but as I said, best to incorporate it within the paragraph about how he challenged the Catholic Church rather than as a bolt-on paragraph in itself. Timing then would be of the essence. 45 minutes to write your answer, 7 paragraphs, it works out 6.5 minutes per paragraph. That equals your 45 minutes. And you've got to pretty much rigidly keep to that timing. And obviously, it doesn't have to be exactly 6.5 minutes for each of those parts, but if you go over for one part, then you've got to go under for the next, but you've got to maintain that balance and work your way through those 7 areas. And that means, therefore, that you can't write down everything you may want to write down in each of those paragraphs. It depends on how fast you can write. Now, obviously, when you're writing in the final exam, you haven't got the time to write a really, really detailed plan. The planning process is pretty much happening in your head. And in the exam, you pretty much only write down the sort of like key buzzwords for each paragraph. But when you're over the 2 years planning at home and you've got time to write up your plans, therefore you need to have a clear plan. This is an example of one I've scanned from a previous student. It's a well-structured plan. It's exactly this the question about Bismarck's political goals. And as you can see, that this particular plan has the approach of you've got the building block. Okay, so in this particular case, it's stabilised in the 1871 Constitution. The candidate then actually writes out the topic sentence. Okay, and this candidate has called it the hook. It's just another word for topic sentence. And then the candidate has written out here the type of content, the type of development that would go into developing that particular topic sentence. So the material that would go into that paragraph. Now that's 6.5 minutes to do that. Okay. What's also nice about this is that the candidate then thinks about how that paragraph will link to the next paragraph. So the link then goes to the hook of the next paragraph, consolidating unification. So the linkage is important. More on that in my second video, where I give sort of general advice for this particular essay question. There's another example of a plan. I've scanned it from another candidate in the past. This is one that I liked. So again, you can just see a similar approach. So they use the word hook, which is the topic sentence. So they don't just write out what the theme. I mean, the theme Constitution Reichstag. That's not enough. They actually plan and write out what their topic sentence is. So what's the key point they want to make in that paragraph? That's the key point, the bit that's underlined, and then the type of information they're going to try to include to develop that key point before they move on to the next building block, which is the National Liberals. They actually write the topic sentence into their plan, so they know exactly what the topic sentence is, and how they're going to develop that topic sentence. Okay, there's a good rule of thumb. So I'm following that sort of guidance in the rest of this walk and talk video. In terms of content, before we actually go into the actual plan then, as I said here, you can't really go wrong if you use the material and arguments from the two Stephen J. Lee essays from his book Imperial Germany 1871 to 1918. So much of the content in the detailed plan that follows, that I'm going to walk and talk you through, is taken from these two essays. And you've got scanned examples of both of those essays. You've actually got the scans, including my own notes to those. So why did Bismarck's domestic policies change between 1871? That goes up to 1890. You only need to sort of cover the first bit up to 1879. And then what underlying influences helped shape Germany in the Bismarck era? Okay, so a lot of the good material, and remember what you're trying to do with A-level essays is you've got to really, really push and show that you are working beyond the basic content in the textbook. If you only use the content in the textbook in your answers, you're really not very likely to get anything higher than probably a grade C at the very best. To access the higher grades B, A and A star, you've got to be rising beyond the actual textbook. Okay, so my introduction. So in the introduction, there's a few points there. Focus on the key elements of the question. Show awareness of that time frame. It's 1871 to 1879. And signpost to the key parts of the answer. And this is an important bit. Give a taster of your likely conclusion. Okay. And it's really important to sort of get off the fence. Don't write a bland introduction. Really sort of show an awareness of what the reason they've asked you to spend 45 minutes of your life answering that particular question. So what I've done here is I've actually written an introduction for you. You may want to pause the video and actually just look at this. Okay, and as you can see, I've used colour coding, green, red and black. Black bold, to sort of highlight the strengths of the introduction. I'll just read it through with you, okay? So Bismarck's overarching goal was to consolidate and strengthen the newly united Germany of 1871. At heart, Bismarck's political values were typical of his own background as a Prussian junker. He was at heart authoritarian, but he knew that to achieve his goals he needed to be flexible, make compromises, and in particular harness the power of the middle classes, which required him to create an illusion of democracy. A key feature of the early 1870s was therefore his willingness to work with the National Liberals in the Reichstag in order to secure the passing of legislation to strengthen national unity. But Bismarck's policies had to change and adapt to unforeseen developments such as the 1873 economic depression and to his own failings, especially the unsuccessful attacks on German Catholics and Socialists, which meant that by the late 1870s Bismarck's political aims had moved further to the right wing of politics. Arguably, Bismarck was unsuccessful because he was forced to change and adapt his policies due to events beyond his control, although many historians argue that he was successful because he was pragmatic and an opportunist responding to events but never losing sight of his goals. So there are key strengths within that. Okay, you can see in green references to keywords in the question. Okay, so frequently uses the word goal or aims, frequently refers to successes and failures, clearly shows the examiner you've noticed it's about political goals. Okay, then in red, shows an understanding of the time frame. Notice the dates, doesn't treat the whole period as a whole, but shows knowledge of how things changed over time. So in your introduction, you're sort of therefore justifying to the examiner, you're saying, look, I'm going to be writing a chronological analysis here. I'm not going to sort of be jumping all over the place. I'm going to work my way through the time period, but don't worry, it won't be a narrative, it's going to be an analysis. You're showing that to the examiner. And then in bold black, notice how there is real historical knowledge, including key words. The word authoritarian there, reference to the middle classes, the National Liberals, the 1873 economic depression, the attacks on Catholics, the attacks on socialists, the move to the right wing, keywords pragmatic opportunists. It's littered with knowledge. And yet that is not an excessively long introduction. Remember, you've got about 6.5 minutes to write your introduction. You should be able to write that well within 6.5 minutes. Have a go, pause the video, read it, and then get a bit of paper. And without looking at this, what you're looking at here, have a go at writing an introduction. Time yourself, get it right. That's the only way. Practice makes perfect. But notice the sort of like structure of a good introduction, and in your next essay, try to emulate that. Okay, so that's your introduction. We then move into the 5 main parts, the building blocks. Okay, so within this, I'm not going to read it all. You can pause the video and read it yourself. You can also obviously download. You've got the links in the email. You can download the PowerPoint that this video is walking and talking you through, and you've also got the Word document with exactly the same information in it, okay, to use. But let's just go through. So the first of the 5 building blocks will be about Prussian control, okay? But we're not just happy to use the words Prussian control. We're going to write out that topic sentence. So my topic sentence is, Bismarck's key goal in 1871 was to create a constitution which would ensure that the key aspects of imperial policy was controlled by Prussia, and in particular by himself as Prime Minister of Prussia. Okay, and you got 6.5 minutes to sort of like develop a point about did he succeed. And I would actually strengthen that further, and I would actually then say my second sentence very quickly would be to say, on the whole, he was successful. Okay, and then you want to sort of develop that point in 6.5 minutes. Now there's the type of development here. So there's our topic sentence again, and there is the development. Okay, I'm not going to read it all through with you, but they're all examples of the type of thing. Remember, Bismarck was fundamentally one of the main architects of the constitution that was created when Germany was created. So it's relevant to the question. It's political. It's a goal, isn't it? It's a political goal to create a constitution that will allow Prussia to have political control over the whole of Germany. So you develop the points, Berlin being the capital, the Prussian Prime Minister being the Chancellor, the way the constitution was structured so that defence and foreign affairs were controlled by the imperial government, not by the state governments, the Bundesrat, the upper levels of the imperial administration, the state, the civil service, the judiciary and the army was staffed by Prussian Junkers. So that's all examples of the type of evidence you could use, your precise knowledge, to substantiate and show that Bismarck successfully developed a constitution that the goal of which was to strengthen Prussian control over Germany. It's very relevant to the question. Okay, so there's your first paragraph. Let's move on. Then, again chronologically, staying in the early 1870s, you want to develop a point about the alliance with the National Liberals. So my topic sentence would be along the lines of: Bismarck's main political goal after 1871 was to consolidate and strengthen German unity. Because the unification of 1871 was complete. There's our link, because the previous paragraph was about the unification. If the new Germany was to develop into a great power, she needed to industrialise, which required Bismarck to give the German middle classes a stake in the new empire, even though this went against his authoritarian values. So what the topic sentence is clearly doing here is it's explaining the goal. Okay, it's not just stating the goal, it's explaining it. The underlying reason why Bismarck needs to get the buy-in of the middle classes is the middle classes are the leaders of industry, and Germany must industrialise if Germany is going to sustain or achieve a position as a great European power. Germany can't just stand still, it's got to industrialise, and to industrialise you can't just have the upper classes running the country. You've got to create an illusion that the middle classes have got a stake in the empire and get them to buy into the new empire. So therefore it's an illusion of democracy. Okay, so you've got to develop that point. Okay, and we've covered that in class. Now, how do you develop? Well, there's lots of information you can bring. So again, there on that side is examples. Okay. Now, 6.5 minutes, you're probably not going to be able to write fast enough to be able to include all of that. So you've got to basically think, what are the key points I want to bring out to sort of like show precise knowledge for that particular goal. Okay, so the illusion of democracy, giving all men the vote, the fact that Bismarck, he can certainly rely on the German conservatives, but he's got to get the support of the National Liberals because they are the largest party, and they're the party of the middle classes, the leaders of industry. It's an unnatural alliance with the National Liberals. It's against Bismarck's instinctive feelings. He's a Prussian junker, but nevertheless he's a pragmatist, he's an opportunist, he needs to do that. And there it is an important point to hit that sort of like top levels. It's sort of showing an awareness of what we call synoptic knowledge, that you know more than just about what was happening in Germany at this time. You've got an awareness beyond that. There was a genuine European trend at this time to bring in the middle classes, to give the middle classes a say in the running of the countries. It happened in Italy, it was happening in Britain. And although Bismarck found it distasteful to allow the middle classes to have a political say, he needed to harness the forces of the age, which was necessary for modern industrialising nations. Okay, so show your knowledge. Bring in the names of the leaders of the National Liberals, Bamber and Lesker. Mention the key laws that Bismarck was able to pass through the Reichstag with National Liberal support, which brought about greater national unity. But all times you've got to link it to the question, was it a success or a failure? It was a success because he's creating national unity. But on the other hand, it was partly a failure because by working with the National Liberals, Bismarck alienated his own Prussian-based Conservative Party, who resented the way Bismarck was flirting with liberalism, was forming alliances with the middle classes. His own people within the Reichstag were resentful of that. So you could argue on one level it was a failure. Then the Kulturkampf. Now remember what we said. The Kulturkampf was a policy, not a goal. Okay, the goal was the fight against internationalism. So your topic sentence needs to make that clear. It needs to link it to the goal. So my topic sentence would be: a key strand of Bismarck's policy of working with the National Liberals. There's the link, because the previous paragraph you've just linked with it was about the National Liberals. In the early 1870s was the struggle for culture, also known as the Kulturkampf, in which Bismarck's goal was to eradicate the internationalist influence of the Catholic Church. That's one sentence, very clear. Okay, so you've linked it to the previous paragraph there, in that section there. and you've then clearly highlighted the goal of the policy. Okay, so you're showing that awareness of a policy as a means towards achieving a goal that was talked about earlier. And then again, you've got the topic sentence there on the left, and the type of content, which you can pause the video and read through yourself. Notice it was both a success and a failure. This is A-level, don't be simplistic. It can be both. This is where you can make the distinction between short-term failure, long-term success. Use that sort of language to say it's not as simple as saying it was a success or a failure. It was elements of both. So again, notice the detail. You're showing that sort of knowledge, the percentages, the names of places where the threat existed, and then the policy itself, the May laws of 1873, the type of details. So the argument that it was a success because it ultimately won him the support of both the German Conservative Party and the National Liberals. Successfully used the Kulturkampf to strengthen his alliance with the National Liberals at the time when he needed their support. But obviously there was great resistance from the Catholics, and in the end Bismarck had to abandon the Kulturkampf, but that tactically made sense because at that point he needed to break his alliance with the National Liberals because he wanted to follow the policy of protectionism as we move into the late 1870s, and you can therefore see the link with the next and final, this is an area which, again, I think definitely needs to be brought in at this point. So my paragraph 4, the anti-socialist policies, okay, from 1878 onwards. Now the linkage again is fairly obvious. You've just, in the previous paragraph, you've discussed the war against the Catholics. The Catholics are an international force. Well, the war against the socialists was all part and parcel of Bismarck's taking on international threats to German unity. So my topic sentence would look something like this. A hallmark of the mid-1870s was the way in which Bismarck shifted the political balance by moving away from his tactical alliance with the NLs, National Liberals, which that was a tactical alliance. It was necessary to pass laws early on to strengthen national unity, and it was necessary as part of the war against the Catholics. But how he then reverted back in the late 1870s to a more authoritarian right-wing goal. And the first reason for this was the rise of socialism. There were two reasons, and obviously the second reason we'll come into in the final building block. But this first reason was the rise of socialism. And that was most evident in 1878 when Bismarck announced the anti-socialist laws, which were on the whole a failure. So again, you're linking the topic sentence very clearly with the question. So again, there on the left, you've got the topic sentence, and here's the type of detail that you would then use in making sure that you link it very clearly to the question. You're always arguing about whether it was success or a failure. Overall, it was a failure. That's clearly mentioned in point G. But in developing that, you've got to show precise knowledge. Okay, there's again a synoptic point, part of a general European trend. Socialism was especially strong in France. It wasn't just in Germany. Bismarck had concluded by the mid-1870s that he had overestimated the Catholic threat. Bismarck was appalled by the long-term plan of the SPD, which aimed to bring about a socialist state that would subvert the 1871 German constitution, that would put a stranglehold on labour, on German, the working classes, by making the trade unions more powerful, etc., etc. So Bismarck's initial impulse was to go on the attack, hence the 1878 socialist laws. On the whole, they didn't work, they were ineffective. The SPD used evasive tactics. Again, there's really good knowledge there from Carr, I think that is, nothing on that in the textbook. So you're sort of showing how did they evade the laws through using gymnastic and cycling clubs as a mask for local socialist organisations that basically went underground, and socialist organisations just simply had a different guise. So as a result, Bismarck was forced to retreat. As we move into the 1880s, he decided he had to kill socialism through kindness, through introducing laws that would try to win the working classes towards Bismarck, away from the SPD. But overall, Bismarck failed. We can now see, looking over time, the steady, and then notice that you've got lots of statistics there that really shows precise knowledge. So again, 6.5 minutes to develop that as a proper paragraph. Again, my advice is have a go, write your topic sentence and develop it, and time yourself and get that done in 6.5 minutes. You will be able to do it, even though you may not be able to get all the information there that you're looking at on the screen. And then my final paragraph, again, the same characteristics. You know what you want to talk about. It's going to be about moving to the right wing in the late 1870s, which necessitated breaking that tactical alliance with the National Liberals. My topic sentence will be there. The second reason, see, again, there's a natural link, because in your previous paragraph you said the first reason for moving his goal more to the political right wing was the unexpected development of the economic depression that hit Germany in 1873, which increased the calls of the Prussian Junkers, the upper classes, to abandon leave alone economics. There needed to be stronger state intervention now that the government needed to interfere in economic matters, and in particular the Junkers were calling for a policy of protectionism, moving away from the previous policy, which had been free trade, laissez-faire. So Bismarck therefore broke his alliance with the National Liberals, because the National Liberals had believed in laissez-faire economics, leave alone. The National Liberals didn't want strong government interference. The National Liberals were against protectionism, and now Bismarck needed to find another ally in the Reichstag to pass protectionist laws, because obviously the National Liberals will vote against it, and so the obvious party was the Centre Party. And this is at exactly the time when the Kulturkampf was obviously failing, and so Bismarck realised that rather than go to war against the Centre Party, if he could get them on his side, so abandon the Kulturkampf and move towards protectionism was the policy. So exactly the same. There in my plan is the topic sentence on the left. How would you develop it? What sort of information would you bring into your answer, into that paragraph in 6.5 minutes? It's there. And again, notice the synoptic knowledge, within that, but sustained throughout, there is a focus on the question, did he succeed? There was a combination of successes and failures. So on one level, failures, but also there were definite successes. So you're not writing a simplistic response, you're writing a sort of balanced response. There we are, more information, a lot there. So it's the same hook. Reducing Bismarck's reliance on the Reichstag. Time was right for Bismarck to abandon his alliance with the National Liberals. There's a quote. On one level turned failure into success. Again, another little quote from Lee. Lee, on the whole, is probably not the best person to quote. It's a very old book. It's written in the 1970s. It's always better if you can find a good recent historian like Evans to quote. Notice that sort of powerful point that, Bismarck was forced to abandon his alliance with the National Liberals, and to do that he needed to ally with the Centre Party and with the conservative right-wing groups, the Prussian Junkers. They were of his own class, but Bismarck never liked that. He became dependent on his own social class, on the Junkers, to get laws through. And also you could argue that politics had become polarised, that in the meantime the political left was continuing to grow more and more powerful on the left, and yet Bismarck's power base was based on a concentration of the forces on the right, what we call Sammlungspolitik, the alliance of steel and rye, which was necessary, but in the bigger picture, it was actually fracturing, it was actually creating divisions within Germany. And that's something which Bismarck did not want. He wanted national unity. And to a large extent, by the late 1870s, Germany was becoming divided. I think was a key point there. So a conclusion. Again, 6.5 minutes to write a conclusion. You've got to be very succinct, not a wasted word. So my key points. Although Bismarck experienced short-term failures, in the long term he was successful. So there's a distinction there. You're moving beyond simplistic comments. You're saying, well, it's not as simple as saying he succeeded or failed. We're talking about a 10-year period here. Things changed over time. There were elements of each. In the long term, on the whole, he was successful. He responded to developments. He was responsive. He seized opportunities, switched his policies. Ultimately, he was in control, steering the ship through unexpected developments. So it looked as if he was sort of changing his mind because, tactically, he was allied with the National Liberals early on, and then he dropped the alliance. That's not a sign of weakness. That's a sign of being a tactical politician. Always got his clear eye on the long-term goal, Realpolitik as we call it. Bismarck himself recognised what he was doing. There's a really nice quote which you can see in the back of the chapter from Lee, where he talks about floating with the time stream. But he was saying he was steering, not just floating. He was doing more than just float. If you're floating with the time stream, it's just like the events of the age are carrying you along and you're not really in control. Whereas Bismarck famously said, I am being carried along by the events of the age, but I am steering within it. So those are all arguments that he was a success. On the other hand, the period 1871 to 9 should not be viewed as a whole. Relatively speaking, the early 1870s were more successful. There was an atmosphere of liberal optimism. New country coming together, the National Liberals in the Reichstag working with Bismarck, unitary laws being passed. But by the mid-1870s onwards, there was an atmosphere of crisis. Bismarck saw enemies everywhere. He's moving to the political right. He's taking on the Catholics. That failed. He then takes on the socialists. That failed. He then moved to ally with the more traditional forces on the right wing, the conservative Junkers, the alliance of steel and rye, the Sammlungspolitik, because he was overreacting to the international threats of Catholics and workers. So again, finishing off with a little quote from Lee. As I say, it's good to include a quote in the conclusion. So this was no artificial alliance forged by Bismarck to prolong his career, but rather the emergence of an elite which was to dominate the rest of the period of the Second Reich. It's a nice little quote, that, because Bismarck obviously did not survive beyond 1890. But we can now see that by 1879, Bismarck had moved towards the far right. He had become dependent on the Prussian elites and the new industrialists in order to ensure he had support in the Reichstag. From that point onwards, Bismarck was always uncomfortable with that alliance because it obviously alienated the workers and to some extent the middle classes who were now excluded. And in the bigger picture, after Bismarck had resigned, moving into the reign of Kaiser Wilhelm II, we can actually see that those forces, the alliance of steel and rye, the old elites and the new elites working together, was a negative thing, because it divided Germany and it fractured German society. But secondly, Kaiser Wilhelm II fell victim to those forces, and arguably those were the forces that led Germany into Weltpolitik, world policy, that ultimately steered Germany in a direction that took her into World War One in 1914. Good synoptic point to finish on. So there is the answer. There is the plan. Best advice if you're disappointed with your essay. You've got the plan there. 7 building blocks, about 6.5 minutes for each. Sit down, memorize it, learn it off by heart, and then have a go at writing the answer again using this particular plan as your template, to see if you can improve, and then give it in and I'll have a look at it and give you a second mark. That's entirely up to you. Unless, of course, you've so significantly underachieved that you have no choice. One or two of you will definitely have to repeat the question. Hopefully this video was useful to you. There is a second part that gives more general advice, which you can now move on to now.